Hey guys, what's up? Reza here, back again with another video. This time we're going to be discussing how you should build Ganyu to prepare for her release in mid-January 2021. The reason why this is called a preparation guide is because Ganyu at this current moment is not yet released yet, so some aspects to her numbers and her overall kit may change, but overall this guide should still remain viable and help you guys know how to prepare for her release should you plan to summon for her. Specifically, I'll be discussing Ganyu's kit, some talent level priorities, weapon choices, constellation bonuses, artifact builds, and finally some teammates and overall strategies. So let's get started by talking about her kit first. Going into her kit first, Ganyu is the second Cryo archer besides Diona, but unlike Diona, Ganyu can actually perform both DPS roles and support roles fairly well. Ganyu gains more cryo damage bonus upon each ascension that does not give another passive skill, for up to 38.4 cryo damage bonus at the final ascension. If you combine this with the 2-piece new cryo set and a 5-star cryo cup, you will have 100% cryo damage bonus without any other passives activated, which is pretty insane, among the highest among all characters. Ganyu's auto or charge attack skill is very different from the rest of the archers we've seen so far as well in this game. While her normal attack is pretty much the same as any other archer, hitting 6 times with her bow, giving her a look at those beautiful assets, her charge attack is essentially another skill entirely. The arrow has 2 levels of charge, the first level of charge being like most archers, having a charge shot infused with their element, which would be Cryo in this case. However, the second level of charge fires off a Frost Flake arrow, which will hit an enemy for massive cryo damage, and on top of that, creating a Frost Flake bloom that will deal AoE damage, cryo AoE damage. The scaling is also pretty nuts, and we'll cover that when the actual damage numbers during the weapon section of this video, so stay tuned. So Ganyu's elemental skill is a taunt that deals damage on activation as well as when it explodes. Some people like to say this as a meme of being a cryo Amber, but unlike Amber, Ganyu has multiple ways of abusing this elemental skill, mainly in regards to keeping enemies in your burst for continuous damage, or lining up the Frostflake AoE to get more DPS on your charge attacks. And finally, Ganyu's elemental burst creates a huge field, which roughly looks like the majority of most Abyss stages, and drops icicles at a fairly fast pace towards enemies. These icicles deal cryo damage, which can be useful for setting up cryo-based reactions, such as melt, or freeze, or possibly even superconduct, and may help you decide if you want to equip a 4-piece cryo set for a constant 20% crit rate without the freeze. This ult has the potential to deal a good amount of damage and doesn't require Ganyu to be on the field after it activates, so you can combo Ganyu's burst with, for example, Klee, and basically get constant melt reactions going off. So going into her passives, Ganyu's first combat passive boosts the crit rate of subsequent Frostflake arrows and their blooms after a Frostflake arrow is fired by 20%. This allows her to create more reliable crits on the bloom, which in tandem to her resonance for Cryo, plus the 4-piece can pretty much allow her almost always crit, if not very, very reliably. And her second combat passive boosts all active party members' cryo damage by 20% within the AoE of her burst. This boosts the damage of current and future. Next, going into which talent priorities she should level. So for her leveling the talents, I would recommend that you level the auto charge attack first, as majority of your damage will actually end up coming from the Frostlake arrows and their blooms if you run a DPS. If you're planning to run a support version of Ganyu, I would recommend leveling up the burst first, and then the Frostflake, and then the bloom. So now that we've finished talking about her kit and talent priorities, let's talk about which weapons that you should equip on Ganyu. So for Ganyu's weapon choices, we have 2 different builds, a DPS build and a support build. So for the DPS build, there are a variety of options to choose from, but probably at the forefront there will exist 2 options, being the Amos bow and the prototype crescent. Since these 2 have the same substat being the attack, I took the liberty of simulating a level 80 Ganyu with a level 90 weapon against a level 90 enemy, average enemy, with about a little bit above average artifacts, and assuming a crit occurred on the full Frostlake arrow plus the bloom damage. At R1, both these weapons had very similar damage, and the difference was extremely close when the effect was active for the prototype crescent. More specifically, the Amos did about 28,000 damage, the crescent without the effect did about 22,000 damage, and the crescent with the effect did about 25,000 damage. The reason that this is actually so close is that the damage bonuses offered by the Amos bow are actually additive with the cryo damage bonus, which is already pretty high to begin with, which lessens the effect of the damage increase offered by Amos. So pretty much as a summary, without comparing the Amos, and comparing Amos to the Crescent for the average player, The Crescent does slightly less damage, but will out-damage Amos as you get more prototypes and refine the Crescent more. If you're a whale who can afford it, you can just refine the Amos more, and it'll out-DPS the Crescent easily. And some other options to consider for the DPS build are the Battle Pass Bow, the Verdicent Hunt, which gets enemies closer together so you can get your Frostblade Blooms to hit more enemies reliably, and in turn increases your overall DPS, as well as the Blackcliff Bow, which is offered in the monthly Glitter Shop, which increases crit damage by a good margin as well as increasing the attack percentage upon defeating an enemy, which can stack. Finally, one more option to consider is the Skyward Harp, but it would only out-damage the crit damage offered by the Blackcliff Bow at refinement level 5. So this is basically if you are a Mega Whale status if you happen to roll that banner and don't want to roll anything more. So for her support options, there's really only one option in my opinion, which is the Favonius Warbow. Her ult does cost 80, so allowing her to get more energy recharge would be greatly appreciated and getting that burst out fairly fast. And so another Cryo DPS can take the wheel and do the damage from there. So now that it overloaded you with way too much information on weapon choices and calculations, we're going to go into the whale territory right now with the Constellations. So before I dive into Ganyu's Constellation abilities, I just want to preface this section by saying that you don't need Constellations for Ganyu to be a good character on your team. Obviously, Constellations are going to greatly help her, but they also pretty much greatly help every single character in this game. You can 1000% clear content well with just a C0 Ganyu, but without further ado, let's just discuss her Constellations. So starting out at Constellation level 1, Ganyu's Frostlake Arrow Earth Bloom hits enemies. It reduces their cryo resistance by 15% for 6 seconds, and it also gives 2 energy on top, which can only occur once per Frostlake Arrow. So the res decrease is very underrated in this game, as not many people realize how good it is, because it essentially turns a debuff into an overall damage buff because of how damage is calculated into the game. Which is why Venner is pretty much always better than the Petra, which I'll discuss that in a future video. But in summary, when Ganyu uses this Constellation ability, you essentially gain a 13.8 overall damage boost instead of a damage bonus, which is actually much better and allows her to do really good damage as well as gain energy for her expensive burst. And going up at Constellation level 2, her taunt gains another charge. It's very simple and allows you to have more uptime on the taunts and allows you to do more damage and will generate more energy for Ganyu for her expensive ult, which is pretty nice. And on Constellation level 3, her burst will gain 3 extra levels, which just does you more damage and requires less resources to do to level up. At Constellation level 4, enemies standing in her burst take increased damage. So starting at 5%, and its effect increases by 5% every 3 seconds for a maximum of 25% while they're on the field, and the effect lingers for 3 seconds after they leave. Very similar to Jean's C6 ability in regards to the field and 3 seconds after they leave. And while I'm not entirely sure how this is treated into the final damage calculation, most likely it's going to end up being an increased damage bonus, which is still pretty solid of ability. But if it was actually an overall damage multiplicatively added on to the final calculation, it would be absolutely nuts, as it would give her more DPS potential, provided as long as you keep the enemies within the field, which can be done through a variety of ways. For example, being freeze, Venti's burst, or you can even do a taunt. This, in my opinion, is still Ganyu's best Constellation ability, and if you stopped here, it's totally fine. You don't need to go any further than this if you're a whale. And moving on to Constellation level 5, her E ability, her elemental skill, gains 3 levels, which is, again, another plus, allows her to do more damage. And finally, at Constellation level 6, after she uses her elemental skill, the next Frostlake Arrow will not need any charge to fire. And this effect is nice, but I feel it's a little bit overrated, since if you miss the arrow, you kind of lose the effect, but it's still a pretty solid ability for getting out those quick shots on the Frostlake arrows. So now that we got the discussion for whale stuff out of the way, let's go back and talk about how you can build artifacts on Ganyu to prepare best for her release. So going into artifact builds for Ganyu, in my opinion, there are 2 builds, a DPS and a support. And so for the DPS build, there are 3 builds to choose from with Ganyu. There is the 2-piece Cryo set with 2-piece Noblesse set, which provides solid damage, or the 4-piece Cryo set, which allows her to crit more often if you decide to spam multiple Frostlake arrows or use the ult for those crits. And finally, there's the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop, which allow her to deal 35% more charge attack damage. However, keep in mind this actually only gives about a 17.5% boost in your overall DPS due to how damage is calculated, so don't be fooled. However, being as that you'll probably use Ganyu for a lot of charge attacks in this build, it will still be a very solid option, and for the most part will actually out DPS both of the previous builds, provided that the Frostflake Bloom is treated as a charge attack and not as an elemental skill. Also, keep in mind that farming for the 4-piece troop is in fact really hard because of how it only drops in 40 resin elite bosses or on the weeklies with Child, Dvalin, and Wolfboy. And moving on to individual pieces, so for the hat, you really want either crit rate or crit damage, which kind of depends on how you balance your substats and the weapon you end up choosing in the end. And optionally, if you go with the 4-piece Cryo set to get the but try to get an optimal 1-to-2 ratio. But ideally, you want at least 100% crit damage on Ganyu, so that arrows will deal 2 times the damage. So for the timepiece, you'll really want attack percent or energy recharge percent due to how her ult costs a lot. However, since the attack percent timepieces are much easier to get than the energy recharge timepieces due to how the drop tables is set up, I would probably run an attack piece unless you really wanted to spam the ult for the support build for that Constellation level 4 effect. So for the cup, obviously, you're going to want to get a crowd damage bonus for your increased DPS. And since the flower and the feather are both fixed, you don't really need to worry about that, just the substats for those. And moving into the substats, ideally what you want with this build, you really want to focus on crit damage, crit rate, energy recharge, elemental mastery, and attack percent in that order. Elemental mastery will actually help her if you decide to go down more of a melt route, but keep in mind, due to the ordering of the reaction, she'll only do 1.5 times the damage on melt. Attack percent is actually lower on the priority if you decide to equip the Crescent or the Amos, since you'll already have a crap ton of attack and it all scales additively, which lowers the DPS potential. And if you're running the support build for Ganyu, the best build would just simply be a 4-piece Noblesse with an energy recharge timepiece and good energy recharge substats, and everything else pretty much stays the same on her in regards to the other gears for their main stats as well as the substats. So, now that we're done with the artifacts out of the way, let's finally go into the last part of the video in which we discuss team building and strategies that you can use with Ganyu on your team. So in regards to building a good team for Ganyu and some general strategies you can go with these teams, there are many different ways you can put Ganyu in the team. One team I would probably recommend would be Ganyu, Diona, Jean or Venti, and Bennett. And the main goal of this team is to reduce the resistance of Cryo with the Venerer set, and then melt enemies with your Frostflake arrows. Sucrose wasn't included on this team because the EM combos are kind of hard to pull off with her due to the nature of the melt reaction, removing both the elements. And also, since Diona's on the team, we really don't need another EM battery, as well as the buffs being additive with each other. And if you don't have either Venti or Jean, I would suggest running the Animo Traveler, since the Venerer overall increases your DPS by 28%, which is pretty insane. You can also possibly replace Bennett with Jing Cho if the Bennett is not Constellation level 1 for a more freeze-oriented team, which when used to group frozen enemies together, we can deal large amounts of AoE damage with Ganyu. With this team, we also have access to the Cryo Resonance, which gives more crit rate up for enemies affected by Cryo or Frozen, which allows for her to get faster energy recharge with her and Diona to set up the ult combos you can have with EM, with Diona's heal and EM, and then Ganyu's ult for a lot of damage. So for characters that a support build of Ganyu that would really help would be Razor, actually, since her burst would allow reliably for us to trigger a superconduct ability, which would allow Razor to get much more consistent and reliable damage while he's set up in his own elemental burst. And you can also pair with a prior unit for an easy and reliable 2 damage multiplier, such as Diluc or Klee. But keep in mind that the timing with Klee is kind of unpredictable, and it may mess up your combos, especially with her ult. And one final fun support team would be for a Hydro DPS build with Child for a freeze team, which is kind of underrated in this game because it prevents enemies from being able to shield up. And if you need to get that last bit of damage to kill them, you don't have to actually worry about breaking their shield, and you can finish them off before they regain it. That's it for the video for Ganyu. And overall, I end up thinking that Ganyu will be an excellent addition as both a cryo DPS and a cryo support character, and is easily a high tier character in my opinion. Tentatively, I would place her around A, maybe even S tier, based off how well the animal's reactions with her burst and how her burst is actually works, and as well as the aim shot. And I'll be streaming my polls for her on my Twitch channel, link down below in the description, so feel free to check me out there. And if you guys like the video, it would be an enormous help for you guys to smash the like button and leave a subscribe or a comment, as it really helps my relatively small channel grow more, and it gives me more motivation to put out more guides like this and keep you guys more well informed on Genshin Impact content. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Laters.